But when we got to school, we forgot all about Mrs. Khan because the school was surrounded by hundreds of vans with large round satellite dishes on the roofs and lights and microphones and fluffy grey things on sticks. Staring at us were hundreds of cameras on legs, which looked like one-eyed insects that could zoom their eyes in and out and swivel their heads in any direction they wanted. And all of them had lots of people bobbing up and down behind them. As we walked towards the gates, a woman suddenly cried out, "There they are!" and started running towards us. I could see Mr. Irons standing by the railings and looking at us, his eyes narrowed and his nose high in the air. His moustache was twitching. "No comment!" shouted Michael as he began running towards the school gates. We all ran too, but before we could reach them, lots of cameras and arms and legs had surrounded us and were blocking our way. What message were you trying to send our government? Was this an act of protest on behalf of child refugees around the world? What was in the note? Who put you up to this? Where are you from? Were you born in this country? Would you like to sell us your story? Everywhere we looked, there were lenses and lights and loud clicking sounds. I clung on to Josie and Michael and Tom as the one-eyed machines all pushed us into a circle. I could hear Josie's breathing beginning to wheeze. She doesn't like tight spaces, and my hands were beginning to sweat. Michael and me shouted, "No comment!" but I don't think anyone could hear us. "Everybody stand back right now!" came a cry. And just as suddenly as the scary cameras and reporters and microphones had surrounded us, they all instantly moved away and we could breathe again. "No shame at all!" shouted the same familiar voice, which was getting closer and closer to us. "How dare you harass my kids!" We saw Mrs. Sanders pushing past the cameras like a red-faced bull and reaching out her hand to us. "Stay off school property, and if I see anyone near these kids again, I'll be calling the police and the Queen's Guards." Grabbing my hand, Mrs. Sanders stormed back in through the school gates, pulling us like the trailing tail of a kite behind her. She stopped briefly in front of Mr. Irons, who was now standing by the school doors. "Mr. Irons, you were specifically instructed to wait and bring these children in safely. Where were you?" Mr. Irons gave us all a cold stare, his nose deadly quiet. "I'm afraid I didn't see them," he said, his eyes narrowing even more and his moustache getting twitchier. "You didn't see them! Stay here! I will speak to you later." Throwing open the school doors, Mrs. Sanders let us in and stopped to look down at us properly. She was angrier than I had ever seen her, and her whole face was the colour of an extra bright pink peach. "Are you all okay?" she asked. Her voice was back to a normal volume now, but it was shaky. We all nodded, too stunned to say anything. "Anyone hurt?" We shook our heads. "Good. Now all of you are to go straight upstairs to my office," she ordered, looking over her glasses at us. "You'll find Mrs. Khan already there, along with Ahmed and his foster mom and Miss Hempsey, and 2 police officers who want to have a quick word. I'll be up in just a minute. I need a word with Mr. Irons." And waving us along, she hurried back outside. I think there are 2 types of being scared in the world. The first type is when you do something wrong, like breaking your mom's favorite vase by accident, and you're scared of her finding out, but at the same time, because she's your mom, you know that deep down she won't ever punish you too horribly because she knows that the accidents happen. But then there is another type of scared. It's when something you never ever thought would happen suddenly does. And the idea of it is so awful that you want to run away. I've only ever felt this type of scared once before, and that was when I saw Mom standing in the hospital corridor crying, and I knew right away that something bad had happened to my dad. I was feeling that second time of scared again now, and it made me want to be sick all over the floor. I had never thought that the greatest idea in the world would get us into trouble with the police. And I never ever imagined it would get Ahmed into trouble too. I didn't want him to feel angry at us. But what if he hated us for not telling him our plan, and for the news people knowing about him even though we hadn't meant them to? "Come on," said Josie, putting an arm over my shoulder, and together we all walked in silence up to Mrs. Sanders' office. I took a deep breath and, fearing the worst, opened the door. But instead of angry stares and shaking heads, we found everyone smiling at us. Mrs. Khan ran up and gave us all a hug, and so did Miss Hamsi, and Ahmed looked at us with his white lion eyes and gave us a small wave. His foster mum was holding her hands to her lips as if she was praying and kept saying, "You dear children." And there were 2 police officers standing near the door, but they didn't look angry either and just nodded and smiled at us. "Come and sit down," said Mrs. Khan, leading us to 4 chairs that had been squeezed in front of Mrs. Sanders' desk. We all sat down. I was still feeling jumpy inside, but at least I wasn't feeling sick anymore. As soon as Mrs. Sanders gets back, we want to hear all about what had happened yesterday. "All about what happened yesterday," said Mrs. Khan. "Miss Hamsi will translate everything for Ahmed, and we want you to take your time, because it's all very important." "But Miss, what about first period?" whispered Michael, showing her his watch as it started flashing a blue color. Just as he held it up, the bell for registration began to ring. Mrs. Khan smiled. "Don't worry. Mrs. Stevens is taking the class this morning." We immediately felt sorry for everyone in class. Mrs. Stevens is learning to be a teacher, but she's so boring and always spends so much time writing on the board that everyone hopes she won't ever really become one. Mrs. Sanders came in and, squeezing past everyone, sat down in her big chair that had a squashed green velvet pillow on it. "Right," she said, clapping her hands once. "Begin." Slowly at first, and then getting faster and faster and faster, we began to talk. We talked about how we became friends with Ahmed and how we wanted to help after finding out about where his mom and dad might be. We talked about hearing that the border gates were going to be shut and about all the plans we had come up with to help. I could see Miss Hamsi explaining everything to Ahmed as we went, and his eyes getting wider and wider. But it wasn't until I got out my exercise book and showed everyone the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan that he jumped up from his seat and came to stand next to me. Miss Hamsi had to stand up too as we continued to talk about the letter to the Queen and the presents we were meant to give her, and Stan the taximan, and Davinder the paramedic, and the extra special Coldstream guards who had given us their word. Nobody asked us any questions, not even one. They all just sat and listened and nodded as Miss Hamsi murmured what we were saying in Ahmed's ear. It was